So, Renato, is Trump going to take over the Federal Reserve?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rengappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And we're here to help you break down topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a skeet. Wow, Asha, we had other topics planned, but boy, Trump has done something absolutely unprecedented this week.
He has, and we touched on it very, very briefly and sort of ancillarily, I don't know if that is a word, last week when we were talking about the mortgage fraud investigations into Adam Schiff and Letitia James. And I had mentioned in the pod that also there had been a referral about a, mortgage false statement made on a mortgage against Lisa Cook, a Federal Reserve Board governor. And here we are, because Trump is firing her.
Yeah, it is really astonishing. It's the first time this has happened in our nation's history, and there's a good reason why. Because the Federal Reserve is set up to be non-political, non-partisan, to have an insulation between the political branches and the Federal Reserve. So our monetary policy isn't controlled by what could help somebody win an election. And the idea is that whether we have interest rates up or down, that's supposed to be controlled by economic factors. And whenever politicians have even made noise about interfering with the Federal Reserve, like Trump, there's usually a massive drop in the markets because it's something that the markets don't like for good reason. You want to be able to rely on this currency, the United States dollar, without worrying about potentially having inflation caused by a president who's trying to win an election.
That's right. And the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and the Board of Governors have 14-year terms that are staggered for precisely this reason, so that they overlap and they overlap different administrations. They're not all appointed at the same time, so they overlap with each other. And importantly, they're appointed and cannot be removed. That's the issue here, right? They cannot be removed except for cause.
Yes. And, because no one has ever tried to do this before, we don't even know exactly what that means because it's never happened. It's never been litigated. But Trump has definitely cooked up a cause. And by the way, it's a cause we talked about in our last episode. I mean, it is so interesting that this whole mortgage fraud brouhaha that he's been starting to go after Schiff and Letitia James, of course, is also being used here. And I think the first real victim of that crusade has been the first Black woman to ever serve in the Federal Reserve Board of Governors.
Yeah, that's an important point to make as well. And I think just to emphasize, not only has this never been done before or litigated, so there's no clarity from courts, but also the statute that outlines the Federal Reserve Board terms doesn't define what for cause means. So Congress has been pretty unhelpful in this regard. And just so people know, there's no standard legal definition for cause, but I know that for me, one of the things that has always stuck in my head, just because we were always talking about it at the time when Trump was thinking about firing the special counsel during Trump 1, and I'm sure, like me, Renato, you probably have the special counsel regulations memorized at this point. But we were talking about, the special counsel regulations do define for cause, and I think it's a helpful example of what kinds of things might be for cause in this kind of context. So for the special counsel, it lays out misconduct, dereliction of duty, incapacity, conflict of interest, or violation of department policies. So that's sort of the universe of things that would normally, in these kinds of contexts, fall into the for cause.
That's right. So, and I'm going to make a statement that I don't know. I don't know if you'll agree with me or not. So we'll see. I think if somebody, for example, let's say somebody in the Federal Reserve Board of Governors was indicted for mortgage fraud, that very well may be the facts underlying that may be misconduct for purposes of the statute. The issue here, but the reason I say it's controversial is because even then, of course, the person is presumed innocent and it has to be proven up, et cetera, and so forth. Here, of course, there's not even that. And as we talked about last week, really what Trump is doing here is he's leaping from inaccuracies, false statements in mortgage applications to it's fraudulent. You can prove intent to defraud. And that's a very important distinction. That's generally what all, white collar criminal trials come down to, is the state of mind of the defendant. There's no question that somebody signs a mortgage application or what the mortgage application says. But the question is, was this part of some fraud scheme, or was this somebody who inadvertently checked the wrong box on a form? And that's really, there's a leap here that's coming from, I have a colorable case to look into whether there's mortgage fraud here. Maybe even then, I don't know, to, she committed mortgage fraud. That's, quote, cause for purposes of the statute.
Yeah. So I think I might disagree with you. So you're right that Trump's letter to her references her alleged false statements on her mortgage documents. And I think you're right also that it sounds like something along the lines of misconduct is what is being alleged, even though he doesn't specify exactly, what the cause is that these false statements fall under. It would be misconduct probably. As you said, just simply having the information that there are these two different statements isn't enough. I would argue that an indictment is not even enough, possibly. I think there's an argument to be made that somebody should have the opportunity to clear their name, though, I don't know. I think it's a little bit dicey. The only reason that I say that the feather on the scale falls in favor of giving a chance to do that is that he's in control of the enforcement branch as well, of DOJ. And in fact, he's also in control, and this is really important, he is in control of the agency that provided this information. And I think there is something very problematic there as well, right? That this was a political appointee. This is something that we talked about last week, that clearly dug through and found this information on her.
Yeah, this piece of it's actually kind of an interesting point, and it's a more theoretical one. It's one where I think reasonable minds can differ. I'm going to give you an analogous circumstance. In my state, Rod Blagojevich was indicted, and they started impeachment proceedings. And part of the question was, he has an opportunity, obviously, to stand trial and clear his name and so on. But the context matters, right? And in that circumstance, you had an independent Justice Department, and no one really thought that Pat Fitzgerald and his team, I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office at the time, but was not part of the team that indicted Blagojevich. But, that no one thought they were cooking up anything on Rod Blagojevich, and the underlying facts were highly problematic, right? He was trying to sell a Senate seat and things like that. And here, the issue is, you mentioned, he controls the enforcer. Well, it shouldn't be that way, right? And that's not how it has been. So worth noting that for decades, although technically speaking, the president is the head of the executive branch, there has been norms that have been set up to have an independence of the Justice Department. And in a world in which there was very serious allegations of fraud that were being levied against the Board of Governors, in a different circumstance we could imagine public calls on the person to resign and a different way of looking at this. Here, of course, I think everyone is skeptical for good reason that suddenly all of these Trump enemies are suddenly being investigated for mortgage fraud, and there's criminal referrals. On its face, it's obviously sketchy, to use an Asha kind of term, right? Hinky,
Yeah.
hinky. Sorry,
I would say sketchy. Good, that goes beyond hinky. So the person at issue here is William Pulte. Is that how you say it? He's a Trump loyalist who heads the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And what is especially sketchy here, so that agency oversees mortgage markets, is that he tweeted findings that Cook had fraudulently declared several principal or primary residences for, her mortgage applications. That's just not, it just, that in and of itself, I think, casts doubt on the good faith of, the allegation itself, which is why I say that even if then it results in an indictment, and not for nothing, Renato, but we see that the DC U.S. Attorney's Office is overcharging crimes in DC. In other words, there's also good faith in the way that the Justice Department is charging crimes. They're not doing so well. We can talk about that later. But so I would be inclined to not to give someone in this kind of situation a true opportunity to clear their name before.
Right. No, I hear you.
Especially
I think that's
at the high bar of having to prove the knowledge requirement, which is what that turns on, and which would really only be proven, I guess, in a trial, really, unless she.
Correct. That's right, and that's why I said the context matters. Right. This is not a circumstance in which you have a Justice Department, 20 years ago that was operating in a more independent way that had very serious allegations. We're in a different world and a different context. Well, what's interesting to me about this, Asha, first of all, obviously we talked last week about how there's an irony, right? Where Trump is accusing people of doing things that he himself was investigated for doing. We'll talk a little bit more about another circumstance of that later this episode. Okay, that's a running theme here. But, we have talked about issues relating to this before in this podcast. And, one thing that we did, of course, we broke down a Supreme Court case earlier this year that when we talked about Humphrey's executor potentially being overturned. And here we are now, some of the discussion we had then about maybe the Federal Reserve being different coming into play. Yeah.
And we'll link to that podcast episode in our show notes because we had a great guest for that episode. If you're talking about the same one where Rachel Barkow came and explained to us the whole situation with Humphrey's executor. Should I give a recap here so that people...
I think so. I think so. It's complicated.
It is complicated. So we were talking about, at the time, a case that was going up to the Supreme Court where the government was appealing a lower court injunction against Trump's firing of two officials in two different agencies, the National Labor Relations Board and the Merit Systems Protection Board. Both of those had been created by Congress and had protections for the people that were commissioners or the senior people that were running it. And there is a Supreme Court precedent called Humphrey's Executor, which had said that agencies that are quasi-judicial, quasi-legislative, that consist of a body of experts and that don't really engage in sort of substantial executive, like enforcement, authorities, that Congress can actually create these kinds of guardrails, that the ordinary ability of the president to be able to hire and fire executive branch officials can actually be curtailed in these kinds of situations. And then she was talking about how since then, the court has kind of said, yeah, but not this agency and not that agency. And soon after that, by the way, the Supreme Court did issue an administrative stay of those injunctions, which allowed Trump to proceed with those firings. So suggesting that the Humphreys executor paradigm was not going to last for long. But Rachel also talked about another case called Sila Law that was one of these cases where the court was saying, yeah, but this protection doesn't apply in this case. But in this case, they single out the Fed as being unique. And so that was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And they're saying, but the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau is very different from the Fed because it's not a body of experts. It's not nonpartisan. But basically, this could potentially tee up this very question, right? Like, in other words, the Supreme Court is basically knocking out all of these agencies and saying, yeah, they don't, Congress can't give these protections. President has the authority to hire and fire. And yet, are they going to be able to maintain this distinction that the Fed is somehow different? And that was sort of the $1 million question. And Trump is sort of teeing it up, though he's also trying to avoid maybe that direct question by using this for cause basis.
Exactly. So that's exactly right, Asha. So if you look at what the Supreme Court did, and the Supreme Court kind of reaffirmed or extended that in Trump v. Wilcox as well. And they said, and I'm going to quote them.
That's the injunction that they granted the stay on recently.
Yeah. They said the Federal Reserve is a uniquely structured quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks of the United States. So this is them trying to look in the penumbra of history of the United States to find some way to say the Fed is different from all these other things that are kind of like the Fed. And they're doing that because they don't want, I suppose, their own index funds and retirement accounts to go kaploomy, right? And to, half in value because Trump wrecks the economy and the United States financial system. And so I think it's fairly safe to say that there are not 5 votes in the United States Supreme Court to allow Trump to just fire Federal Reserve governors just because he wants to. And so he's cooked up this mortgage fraud scheme so he can say, look, I'm going after all these people I don't like. Adam Schiff, Letitia James, the first Black woman ever to serve on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. What a coincidence. It seems like a lot of his targets happen to be Black women. They're not the majority of the people in the United States, but they seem to be a majority of Trump's targets, just saying. He's going after all these folks, and they just happen to be committing mortgage fraud. And in this case, he could tell the Supreme Court can say, well, he did that. We're not going to determine for cause, or it's a political question or something along those lines. But they're not disturbing the fact that he can't just fire Federal Reserve governors without cause.
But yeah, so he is trying to kind of sidestep that. And I think a big question is, because she's now litigating, right? She says, I'm not going anywhere. She has a lawyer, Abby Lowell, who's a fantastic attorney, who is going to challenge this. And I'm just curious what you think about, what are they going to say, that this is not for cause, or that she would, where is this going to go?
So it's going to be very interesting. I mean, obviously she's going to litigate this and create a factual record. And I think it's going to go one of two ways. I mean, either they're going to be able to make a factual record that there's no cause here. Okay. And they just on the facts, he has no leg to stand on. And if that happens, I think that's going to be I have no way of predicting what the Supreme Court's going to do with that, because who knows what these justices in the Supreme Court, are they going to kind of squint and hold the findings in a certain light so they could try to allow Trump to do that. I think what he's trying to set this up for, though, is something where, at least on the law, he can do something that he knows he doesn't have the votes to do otherwise, because there's clearly not the votes to allow him to fire without cause. And so he has to find a way to create sufficient cause.
So this is, I think, just, there's a question of why is this especially serious when he's like breaking norms all over the place. I mean, he's doing a lot of unprecedented things, but I think this one really does this one seems like it's also precisely because this is kind of one area where the Supreme Court has tried to keep these protections in place. And as you noted, Renato, where there's typically been blowback, I mean, this seems like something that there ought to be kind of bipartisan and not ideological divisions on whether or not opening this Pandora's box is a good or bad idea.
Yeah, and I think if you want to run through a thread that we've kind of talked about on a lot of different episodes, Asha, we've talked about when Trump has done things in a not as sinister, clever, whatever devious way versus when he's had a really clever way of getting from point A to point B. This is one where this team that was working on this, I'm sure it wasn't him, but that team figured out a way to get from point A to point B and at least put themselves in a spot where they may, obviously she's going to be litigating, but they have a chance of having this go through.
Having this go through meaning prevailing.
Correct. And actually having the firing be effectuated. I think that if they just fired her without cause and just said, hey, under the powers invested in me, by the Article 2 of the Constitution, I think that they would lose. I think that it's pretty clear to me that, like the case I cited, the Wilcox case and others, that they don't have 5 votes, but they might have 5 votes in this cause thing.
But that just feels like putting lipstick on a pig, because if what you are doing, as you mentioned, Renato, if this was something that came up organically, it would be one thing. But if what you're doing is ordering your agencies to go on fishing expeditions to find evidence of wrongdoing that can then be used as bases for firing someone for cause in a position where for cause isn't even defined, then I think what you are, to answer our question that we opened the show with, he really could take over the Fed. I don't see what would stop him, right? Because then what do? You get the IRS to look at all their tax returns. You look at all their mortgage statements. There is a ton of data that is, and documents and filings that everybody has done. We do this with the understanding that these agencies are only going to use it for the purpose of that agency, right? And that, I guess the IRS does audits and stuff like that, and there is a system, but that they're going to follow their normal processes. I just wrote a piece for my Substack on the presumption of regularity, right? Like if wrongdoing surfaces in the normal functioning of their business, then yes, it could get referred to the Department of Justice. But there are, and in fact, with the IRS, there are statutory protections in place to prevent these kinds of fishing expeditions because Nixon tried to do that.
Right. Well, here, it's interesting, Asha. What's really happening here is what one could call weaponization, right, of the United States Justice Department and a variety of other agencies to further the political ends and personal vendettas of the president of the United States, Donald Trump. Now, the irony, of course, is that Trump and the Republicans have used that term and have owned that term and have done that purposely, in my view. And this is a sort of 1984 War is Peace, the sort of thing where they're basically trying to turn everything on its head, because Trump was actually out there committing crimes like, I don't know. He actually had, ballrooms full of classified documents, for example. He was actually trying to incite an interference in the lawful functions of the United States in January 6th, things like that.
He was actually trying to defraud banks.
Right. Things of that nature. And yet, they to sort of make it seem like and I'm going to use a phrase, one person's weaponization is another person's justice sort of thing. Like, hey, everyone can get targeted by the Justice Department. Everyone can be accused of committing crimes. They're really ginning this up and turning, I'd say, even the term or understanding of, you're calling regularity, or the flip side of it, weaponization. They're purposely turning that on its head in a very Orwellian way.
Yeah. And I think it really drives home why it matters so much who is in these positions. Because, we really rely on the good faith, the general good faith of the people running these agencies and our government to operate under the systems that are in place so that we can trust outcomes when they happen. And I just think that a really, really unfortunate outgrowth is that it's just becoming impossible to really trust anything.
Well, and that's why I really see such a difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2.
Yeah.
When I say that, Trump, the first Trump administration was full of people who had been career servants or people who were just Republicans who had been around a long time, who drew lines in the sand and cared about their integrity and cared about their reputation and created pressure, internal pressure against Trump. Trump had to fight against his own cabinet to get things done. That's not happening this time around. In fact, they're helping him concoct ways to get where he wants to go. I mean, and that's very dangerous for the United States of America.
In Trump 1, his entire senior Justice Department, except for Jeffrey Clark, threatened to resign.
Right. And that's not happening now. And that's not that his entire cabinet. I'm sure you saw a recent cabinet meeting where they're all fawning over him and praising him. That is the cabinet we have now, not a cabinet where you had, if you recall, most of his early cabinet all ended up leaving in the first term because they were, they were fired. But my point is they were trying to create roadblocks to him. It's a disaster for our country. And that's why this is our lead story this week. Well, Asha, speaking about disasters, and weaponization, and Trump accusing others of doing things that he himself did. We have John Bolton, who, by the way, is one of a person who had in the first Trump term pushed against Trump at times, tried to put the brakes on some things Trump did at times, who became a Trump critic and wrote a book. I think it was In the Room Where It Happened or something.
The Room Where It Happened.
The Room Where It Happened, in which he talked, I would say it's fair to say it's pretty critical of Donald Trump. He's now under federal criminal investigation for mishandling classified materials.
That's right. So this was the news drop on Friday that we thought was going to be the lead story before it got eclipsed by something even worse. But he had his home and office searched for, I guess, evidence of the crime of mishandling classified documents. We think that's the crime. And that's, it was a little bit difficult because on the one hand, we know that Trump is not a fan of John Bolton. That's actually his words after the search happened. We know that the Trump administration tried to block the publication of his book. They opened a criminal investigation of him at the time. Since Trump took office again, he stripped John Bolton of his security detail, even though Iran had threatened his life. And actually in 2022, an Iranian national was charged with a plot to assassinate him. So Trump clearly has personal feelings about John Bolton and is not particularly concerned about his well-being. But on the other hand, you and I both know that getting a search warrant, that's not a rubber stamp.
Correct. So a couple things here, right? So there was, as you pointed out, the first Trump administration not happy with John Bolton. They initiated a criminal investigation, I believe, in connection with the publication of that book because he did not get the authorization you ordinarily would get to talk about certain matters that were discussed in that book. I would say imprudent on his part, to put it mildly. That investigation continued into the Biden administration. It wasn't just a button wasn't just pressed and that was ended. In fact, that did extend for a period of time. They ultimately closed it, but there was something to that. I think it's fair to say. That would be my judgment from afar. Without knowing all the specifics. That would be my
specifics, and I can fill you in.
Okay, well that's okay. We'll get there, but I want to lay the groundwork here.
Yeah, go ahead.
And now we have this happening in the second Trump administration. And people, I think, assumed that, this is the Trump administration resurrecting that old matter and bringing it back up again. But actually, the public reporting has been that this was due to overseas intelligence that was gathered. It was unrelated to the stuff that was in the book. It was some new information. And as you point out, a federal judge signed a search warrant for the search of his home. And you're right, Asha, that isn't just a rubber stamp. In fact, it means that the judge made a finding that there's probable cause, which is essentially good reason to believe that a crime was committed, and that evidence of that crime would be in John Bolton's home, which is a very bad thing for Mr. Bolton. So I do think there is something to this. And it's weird because, of course, just to harken back to what we talked about just a minute ago when we were discussing his firing of the Fed governor, that we can't take anything that the Trump administration says at face value. So we don't really know what to believe when something like this happens.
Yeah. And just to emphasize, there were two places searched, his home and his office. And his home is in Maryland and his office is in DC. So that would have been two search warrants, which likely would have been two different judges.
Oh, it'd have to be. Yeah, I would assume. Yeah, no, they have to be. You have to have venue. So they would have gone to a judge in Maryland and a judge in DC, I would believe. Certainly the ordinary course. Yeah.
Yeah. So that definitely, I think, again, to use that term, presumption of regularity, is it helps us feel like that was followed. I mean, for anything, because there is this impartial, neutral third party that is approving this. So the backstory is this. So John Bolton leaves the Trump administration in 2019, or he's fired, depending on who you ask, whether you ask him or Trump. And 2 months later, he's got a book deal. 6 months later, he's got a manuscript. Now, in the government, when you are in a sensitive position like John Bolton was, you have to submit your manuscript for something called pre-publication review. And there's an office in the different agencies, and in this case, the National Security Council, that conducts a pre-publication review. And the pre-publication review goes through the manuscript to see if there is anything in there that is classified. And the process is supposed to favor the First Amendment rights of the person, the author. In other words, they are there just to literally just fact check whether there's anything that's classified, or if it's now been released or unclassified or in the public domain. Bolton did this. The person who did this was a career employee that had been detailed to the NSC from the National Archives. After 4 months of back and forth, because I guess it did initially contain a ton of classified information, she helped him clean it up. And she told him that it no longer had classified information. But he never got formal authorization from the White House. And he waited and he waited. He kept asking for it. They never gave him formal authorization. And he went ahead and published it. And that's when the Trump administration filed their civil lawsuit, seeking an injunction, and also saying that he had violated his non-disclosure agreements. The injunction was denied, but the judge in that case had some pretty damning things to say about John Bolton, and basically said there was classified information in this. He's opened himself up to liability, and so the lawsuit proceeded, and that the same judge, even though he denied the injunction, let the lawsuit continue. And then there was a separate criminal investigation, presumably into unauthorized disclosure of classified information, which itself is a crime. And then, as you said, the Biden administration dropped the lawsuit, and it's not clear what they did with the case. I don't know that it was closed or if it was paused or whatever. But as you said, there was speculation that initially that these searches were related to that. But Renato, as you know, that would be really unusual because all of that took place 5 years ago. And the search warrant, to show probable cause, you have to show that the probable cause exists now. Like the judge would have to know that like there's like notes sitting on his desk at that moment, not that some witness saw it there in 2020.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, now with particularly with electronic records, for example, you can sometimes people you'll have an agent say that's in their training experience. You keep them for periods of time, but how would you know that they'd be located there in, let's say, his office versus in the cloud somewhere, right, or whatever? And if there are written materials, like you said, generally speaking, it's not. The information doesn't have to be immediate, like, hey, Asha just had these papers in there yesterday, but 5 years is a long time, right? So I think you're right. And of course, that's what the public reporting indicates, is that there's some sort of overseas intelligence that indicated that something had happened presumably more recently. And that's what led to this.
So this is a piece that does give me pause. So this was apparently intelligence that was passed from the CIA to the FBI. And the CIA may not target U.S. persons. Definitely not in the United States and not even abroad. So when you're traveling, the CIA can't be, doing technical surveillance on you or getting human sources to go get information from you. However, what they can collect is when they are getting human intelligence or signals intelligence abroad, and they're targeting their foreign targets, they might capture information or they might obtain information about a U.S. person. And this is called incidental collection. In other words, you're not targeting the U.S. person, but, for example, if you're listening to a phone call, you're going to listen to both sides of the phone call. And if your target is speaking to a U.S. person, then you're going to capture that. So this seems like this would be, if it's coming from the CIA, some sort of incidental collection abroad, right? Now, once that happens, even then, technically, legally, the CIA can't just come and like dump it all in the FBI's lap. Typically, the FBI has to have an ongoing investigation, or if they come across information that is, an indication of a violation of U.S. law, they can pass it over. And there are some, buffers on this because the CIA does not really want to do this, because if the FBI goes on to prosecute a case, then they have to share this intelligence, which then potentially compromises the CIA's sources and methods. So it's like there's sort of a built-in, I guess, disincentive for the intelligence community to use this to like go after people. But it's a little bit, it makes me pause. It makes me pause because the CIA director, Daniel Ratcliffe, was one of the affiants in the lawsuit against Bolton. And his deputy, Michael Ellis, was also one of the affiants. And, just to not go into the weeds, but the person who conducted the pre-publication review later submitted a letter to the court saying that both of them had commandeered the pre-publication process and had more or less declared the book classified, basically because Trump didn't want it published. And then meanwhile, Kash Patel, who's the director of the FBI, also had John Bolton on his deep state enemies list. And so, you just see like, okay, this is intelligence that being passed from one to another, and this like, coming from overseas by sources that we don't know. Have they vetted this? Is this raw intelligence? What is it? So, I mean, I think it obviously satisfied two judges. That's good. I'm still curious what it is.
Yeah, it's interesting, and this is why a lot of times we approach things from different perspectives, and the national security perspective you bring to things, I think, is important, Asha. I hadn't focused enough on the fact that the CIA was the one providing the information, and that's really unusual, right?
Very unusual.
The CIA is usually like following around terrorists or other foreign adversaries of other types. They're not out in listening to former U.S. officials, right? Is this potentially Trump using the CIA to spy on his perceived enemies when they're outside of the United States borders? Like, is Rosie O'Donnell going to be the next target?
Well, and on that front, Renato, I'm glad you asked that question, because as you know, in the United States, the FBI and the NSA are governed by a legislative framework called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and there's a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. We can go, I'm sure there will be an opportunity at some point in the future for us to go through all of that. But when the CIA collects abroad using technical, signals intelligence, it is not doing it under the FISA framework. It is doing it under Executive Order 12333, which is basically the executive branch's Article 2 authority to gather intelligence for national security purposes. So there's no judicial constraint. There's no judicial checks. There's nothing. So it does give much greater latitude, right? So if this was something that, and I know people are very cynical about our intelligence agencies, but again, I am just going with the presumption of regularity here. If this was something that even the NSA had passed on to the FBI, I would feel a little bit more confident that it would be happening under, this, these programs, these legislative frameworks that have been in existence for a long time. But the CIA's collection is really kind of they're cowboys, and they can be, because they're not their job is to break the law when they go to these other countries, right? Their job is not, they're not constrained by the Constitution of the United States. So, or except Article 2, which is very expansive right now. Mm-hmm. So I think that there are still some questions. I'm not ready to say, I'm not saying Bolton is innocent and this was a, sham investigation. I don't know yet, but I do think that particular detail, that this was intelligence passed by the CIA to the FBI, raises some questions for me.
Sure. Well, look, John Bolton isn't my favorite person either. There's one thing that Donald Trump and I have in common. I don't think either of us are fans of John Bolton. No, I'm not his biggest fan either. I mean, I don't, but I don't like anyone, Trump or Bolton, having classified material in their home or office or anywhere else that it shouldn't be. That said, I agree with you that we need to be concerned about Trump taking action against his perceived enemies. And, I think in the early days of Trump 2, this administration, you and I were really focused on, will Trump be going after his enemies list? Is he going to be are we going to see the prosecution of, United States versus George Conway, United States versus Norm Eisenhower? Is that going to happen? And this is an example that could be, and we could be, John Bolton may be one of the first, maybe Adam Schiff and Letitia James are second and third. So this is something that I think this runs together with what we talked about last week and what we just talked about regarding the mortgage fraud allegations against the Fed governor. I think it is Trump using the Justice Department potentially to go after his enemies.
And not just the Justice Department. I think the other tie-in with our first segment is the ability to use these other executive branch agencies that have tremendous information under their umbrellas, that have tremendous powers, like the CIA. And if they are only answerable to the president, And if you now have an interpretation of Article 2, which is basically that whatever the president said, if the president does it or says to do it, it's legal, then what you have is an enormous capacity of the executive branch to produce the very, basis for the Justice Department to go after you in these investigations.
Yeah, it's very concerning, and it's a scary time for our country, which is why I suspect we're going to be talking about these topics next week as well. So, Asha, before we go, Travis Kelce proposed to Taylor Swift yesterday. The entire world is turned upside down. I mean, everyone from the AFL-CIO to Charlie Kirk was tweeting their congratulations about.
Really? Charlie Kirk?
Oh yeah.
Congratulations?
Everyone's on board.
I did see that even Donald Trump wished them well.
Yes, everyone wishes them well. Taylor Swift is so popular that they just decided they just can't take her down. That she's just sort of reached a pantheon. She's too much. Oh. It's too much power, too much influence.
Wow.
Everyone's pro Taylor Swift. Are you on that bandwagon, Asha?
So I am plugged in enough that I did see a screenshot of her Instagram post announcing the engagement, which I did think was cute. It was like your English teacher and your gym teacher are getting married. And I think there's some song that she has that alludes to high school something.
Okay.
And there are going to be a lot of Swifties that are like, why don't you know her songs? I do have her playlist. I just haven't, I don't know them by heart or anything like that. I thought that was cute. And I think I don't know a ton about Taylor Swift. I like her. I know that she has been unlucky in love from what I understand for many years. And so I think that's great. Good for her. I will join the leagues of people who are wishing her congratulations, like Charlie Kirk and Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, look, you said, hey, you've seen this, and you're plugged in enough. I think you basically, as long as you aren't as long as you have electricity, I think that this happened because it was that widespread. My wife was so excited. I got a phone call to discuss this, this whole thing, and it was actually becoming a thing on social media where they'd be putting on TikTok, their husband's reaction to Taylor Swift's, or, I think being like, what do I care? Who cares? But I was definitely in that group in that I like Taylor Swift. She's great. I actually really like Travis Kelce, and I like his, Jason. I think their podcast is funny. I actually love Jason's wife. I think is awesome and really smart. But I don't care enough about this to be that excited about somebody I don't know. But great. I think they're fantastic, and I think Taylor Swift's super talented. And I also give Travis Kelce kudos for shooting his shot, because if you recall, he got his date with Taylor Swift by saying in his podcast he was bummed that he went to her concert and couldn't give her the friendship bracelet with his number on it that he wanted to.
Oh, I did not know that was the meet cute.
Well, yeah, he basically said in his podcast, he was bummed. He went to her concert. She didn't come out to talk to the crowd. He had this bracelet because that's a thing, I guess.
Yeah. I do know that. I know enough about the Swiftie culture.
He had his number on it, and he couldn't give it to her. And so he said it on the podcast with his brother, and it went viral. And then they went on a date.
Wow.
Well, there you go. Okay, now Asha, we've gone through the whole cycle. Now Asha really cares.
Yeah, I really care. Well, no, I mean, I've always really liked her. I've always thought, her to be, she has a lot of conviction, apart from her music. And I think cares about, gives a shit about the world. You know what I'm saying? Which is, I think is always, it's just nice to see in a celebrity and musician. And from what I have seen of them as a couple, they seem like they get along really well, and they have a lot of fun together, and they have great personalities, just that mesh.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I actually think beyond all of that, she's an extremely like savvy businesswoman who has built an empire for herself. She's worth, I don't know, like $1.7 billion, I read. And, she's somebody who knows how to stand up for herself. I don't know if you remember when she filed that lawsuit for $1 when that DJ was
grabbed her butt or something.
Sexually assaulted her.
Yeah.
So she's like, she sued him for $1 just to make a point and to get her day in court. And like that sort of thing. I mean, kudos to her. I mean, she's somebody who's achieved a lot for herself. So that I think is worth mentioning on today's podcast. A brighter side to a not so bright podcast this week.
Well, maybe she will be the one that can bring us all together.
It seems so far.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.